I still remember that feeling like it was yesterday. A quiet September morning with mist lingering over the lake behind my small cabin in Vermont. No blaring car horns, no neon signs flashing from New York's billboards. Here, there was only the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the cheerful chirping of birds on the branches. But it was in that very silence that I realized I was lonelier than I had imagined. Every afternoon after class, when I returned to the little house, I would stand by the window and watch the red maple leaves drift in the wind. I had everything I'd ever wished for. A dream teaching job, a life of freedom without constraints. But something still felt missing. One day, I decided to do something to fill the void in my heart. I drove to the local animal shelter near town, where abandoned dogs waited for a second chance. As soon as I entered the dog section, I saw him. A golden retriever with golden fur but profoundly sad eyes. He stood apart in the corner of the kennel, ears drooping as if he no longer expected anything good to happen. A staff member approached me and softly said, "Buddy's been abandoned twice. He's affectionate, but no one has had the patience to love him." I didn't hesitate for even a second. I crouched down, reached my hand out toward Buddy and whispered, "Let's go home together, Buddy." He lifted his sad eyes to meet mine and slowly walked toward me, cautious but trusting. On our first morning at home, Buddy woke me up with the sound of his paws tapping on the wooden floor and his wet nose nudging my hand. I laughed. It had been so long since I felt that kind of lightheartedness. In the afternoon, we walked along the lakeshore. Buddy bounded around like the whole wide world belonged to him. Every time the wind passed by, he would lift his head and take a deep breath as if he wanted to hold on to the scent of the sky and earth. I watched him and smiled. Turns out, with a sincere companion, my heart could feel so light. But I had no way of knowing. Buddy would change my life more than I ever expected. I remember that day so clearly, a cold winter afternoon with a grey sky and a long, silent road. The trees covered in snow looked like they were in a deep sleep. Class had ended later than usual as the students were preparing for their exams, and I drove home with exhaustion in every breath. On the stretch of road leading out of town, the car engine suddenly sputtered, then went silent. I tried restarting it several times, but only the cold, metallic whining of the machinery responded. My car had stalled in the middle of an empty road, surrounded only by forest and an increasingly dark sky. My heart began to race. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the signal was too weak to connect. A strong gust of wind blew past, making me shiver. Just as the panic was beginning to rise into fear, I heard the sound of an engine approaching. I turned around, and the headlights illuminated the snow-covered road. An old green pickup truck pulled over. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out. He wore a thick, grease-stained coat, worn brown gloves, and a knit beanie pulled low over his forehead. Beneath the fabric was a tanned face and deep blue eyes like the ocean. "Is your car giving you trouble?" he asked, his voice deep but calm. I nodded, trying to stay composed, though my tension was evident. He walked over, leaned down and began inspecting the engine. Though he was a complete stranger, his calm demeanor seemed to ease the chill in the air. "It's most likely a problem with the battery," he said, glancing up at me with a reassuring smile. "But don't worry, I can fix it." I stood there, watching him work. Despite his hands being covered in oil, his movements were quick and skillful, as though this was what he was born to do. A few minutes later, the engine roared back to life, its familiar hum breaking the silence of the night. I let out a breath of relief. "All done," he said as he pulled off his gloves and gave me a friendly smile. "I'm Lucas. I run a garage right in town." I smiled back, still a little flustered. "Thank you so much. I'm really lucky you came by when you did." Lucas looked at me, as if he could read my thoughts, and said in a steady but sincere tone, "It's quiet around here, but people are always willing to help each other. If you ever need anything, just call me." He pulled a small, slightly crumpled business card from his coat pocket, the phone number still visible despite the creases. The truck's headlights cast a soft glow over his face as he said goodbye. Amid the white snow and the growing darkness, Lucas's blue eyes seemed to shine with genuine kindness. I stood there watching as his pickup truck disappeared into the snowy distance. That night, I couldn't fall asleep right away. The image of Lucas by his old green truck lingered in my mind. There was something about him, his simplicity, yet warmth, that felt like everything I'd been Lou. The next day, I decided to stop by the small cafe in the centre of town, the place where the locals often gathered after work. And just as I expected, Lucas was sitting at the table near the window, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. He smiled when he saw me walk in. "Emma, right? Is your car doing okay?" I was surprised he remembered my name, but nodded and smiled softly. "It's fine. And thanks again for helping me yesterday." We sat down and started talking. I told him about my years in Boston and the reason I decided to leave the city and move to Vermont. Lucas listened intently, his eyes occasionally shining with understanding. He shared that he had grown up in this town and had taken over the garage from his father. "Some days the work is exhausting, but I've never thought about leaving. Vermont is my home." That word, home, made me pause. Home. I suddenly realized I was still searching for a place to belong. But for Lucas, he had found it long ago, in the simple things he loved. From then on, Lucas and I started seeing each other more often. Whether it was a casual walk around the lake or a quick stop at the cafe during a snowy afternoon, time always seemed to slow down when I was with him. The small stories we shared became cherished memories. Lucas wasn't the kind of perfect man I had encountered in the big city, but it was his authenticity that made me start to open up, like a calm lake beginning to ripple under the warm sunlight of early spring. I couldn't deny that Lucas had stepped into my life naturally, yet left an unforgettable mark. And I had no idea that my life was about to change in ways I had never imagined. We met so often that the small town of Vermont felt too tiny to contain all our memories. On snowy afternoons, we'd sit in the cafe, looking out the fogged-up window, sharing stories about the past and our dreams for the future. Lucas always had a way of making me laugh, even with simple tales about fixing cars or his awkward attempts at baking for his mom. That day, after work, I saw Lucas waiting outside the school gate, his coat dusted with tiny snowflakes. "Want to take a walk around the lake?" he asked, his voice blending with the gentle chill of the winter evening. I nodded without thinking twice. The late afternoon light fell across the frozen lake, draping the scenery in a soft golden hue, like a dream just beginning. We walked side by side on the path lined with dry leaves and layers of snow. Our footsteps crunched beneath us, the sound oddly comforting in the quiet. "Emma." Lucas suddenly said my name, his voice lowering to a near whisper. I turned to look at him. His eyes were serious in a way I wasn't used to. "I know you love your new life here, but there's still something you haven't let go of, isn't there?" I froze, feeling as if Lucas had seen right through to the deepest fears inside me. I lowered my gaze, avoiding his. "Sometimes, I'm scared that the good things will disappear. I'm afraid I don't deserve them." Lucas stepped closer. I could hear the warmth of his breath in the cold air. He gently placed a hand on my shoulder and pulled me in. That touch broke through every wall I had built. "Emma." His voice was soft, but it sent ripples through every defense I had left. I looked up, and before I could process what was happening, Lucas leaned in. The space between us became so small that I could feel his breath on my lips, making me shiver. When his lips touched mine, time seemed to stop. It wasn't just a kiss, it was every emotion I'd kept bottled up finally being set free. I don't know how long we stood there, but when he pulled back, his eyes seemed to look straight into my soul. I felt as though I had crossed a line I couldn't go back from. "Emma, I'm here. You don't have to be afraid of anything anymore," Lucas whispered, his hands still resting gently on my shoulders. That sense of safety made my heart race, but my mind pulled me back. I took a small step back, feeling disoriented, as though I had just woken from a dream. Lucas. I stammered, unable to find any explanation for myself. That strange yet sweet feeling left me in a haze, blurring the line between right and wrong. Lucas looked at me but didn't push. He gave a slight nod, as if to say he understood that I needed more time. "Let's head back. It's getting colder," he said gently, then walked beside me without saying another word. On the way home, everything around us was as quiet as before, but inside me was a storm of emotions. I couldn't deny it any longer. Lucas had found a way into my heart, and I had allowed myself to cross my own boundaries. That night, I lay on my small bed by the window, watching the snow fall outside as the sound of my heartbeat echoed in my mind, still vivid from when he touched me. But along with that fragile happiness was a vague fear. Was I going too far and about to lose everything once again? I closed my eyes, but my heart stayed awake, full of feelings I couldn't name. The next morning, I woke to the faint sunlight streaming through the window, but I still felt as though I were caught in a dream, suspended between reality and illusion. The memory of last night's kiss played over and over in my mind like a melody I couldn't let go of. Gentle but gripping, making me want to hold onto it and run away from it at the same time. I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of hot coffee in hand, the steam swirling in the crisp morning air. Buddy lay curled up at my feet, his brown eyes gazing up at me as if waiting for reassurance. I stroked his soft golden fur, reminding myself that this was the place I had chosen to start over, peaceful, simple, free of complications. But now everything felt shaken, because of one person. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind, hoping that the movement of the world around me would help me stop thinking about Lucas's gaze, the tenderness in his eyes, as if he was willing to wait for me forever until I was sure of myself. And then, as if the universe knew how to test me, Lucas appeared on the path by the small general store in town. "Emma?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me freeze. I turned around and met his gaze once more, the gaze I had tried to avoid all day. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the slight tremble at the corner of my lips betrayed me. Lucas walked closer, his dark green sweater highlighting his broad shoulders and rugged appearance. The space between us seemed to shrink with each step he took. "Am I making things harder for you?" he asked, his deep voice sounding like a whisper in the quiet air. I gave a small laugh, but it was as fragile as a dry leaf carried away by the wind. "No. It's just—" I trailed off, feeling as though every word got caught in my throat. Lucas reached out and gently touched my arm. A simple touch, but enough to make my heartbeat falter. "Emma, if you're unsure, I won't push you. But if you're running away, be honest with yourself." Each word he spoke felt like a pebble dropped into the unsteady lake of my emotions, sending ripples through my heart. "I don't know what I want," I whispered, almost choking on the words. Lucas was silent for a moment before leaning in, his face close enough that I could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "Emma, I want to be with you not because you're perfect, but because you're you." My breath caught in my throat. A tear slid down my cheek before I even realized it. Before I could think any further, Lucas pulled me into his arms, a firm but gentle embrace, as though he was afraid I might disappear. I didn't resist. I no longer had a reason to resist. As I rested my head against his chest, the sounds around us seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the strong, steady beat of his heart, like a quiet promise. I had crossed the line I had drawn for myself without realizing it. I had stepped into a place where neither reason nor fear could pull me back. That night, I lay awake by the window, with Buddy resting at my side as if standing guard over me. I gently reached out to pet him, silently thanking him for always being my loyal companion during my loneliest days. But now, my heart had changed. Lucas had come into my life like a powerful yet warm wind, sweeping away the walls I had tried to build. I was afraid that if I took one more step forward, I wouldn't be able to turn back. But maybe it was time to stop running, to stop doubting myself, and allow myself to live fully, with every honest emotion I had. Everything felt as though I were living in a beautiful yet haunting dream. Lucas and I were nearly inseparable. Every morning when I sat in the familiar wooden chair on my front porch, instead of the loneliness I used to feel, I now waited for the sound of Lucas's small truck rolling down the dirt path leading to my house. Each time he arrived, Vermont's cold wind seemed a little warmer. Some days he came over just to sit with me over a cup of coffee or to help fix the creaky window hinges that rattled whenever the wind picked up. These small acts made me feel like I had found something I'd always longed for. Someone to share my life with. Someone to trust. One weekend evening, Lucas invited me over for dinner at his place. His small wooden house stood in the middle of a wide open field, with bare trees stretching toward the amber-red sky in the distance. "You're going to love this roast chicken, I promise," he said with a small smile when he noticed my skeptical glance at his modest oven. We prepared dinner together in his small kitchen. I could smell the rich aroma of spices and hear the crackling sound of firewood in the stove. Lucas stood close beside me, and every so often his shoulder brushed against mine. I knew those touches were unintentional, but the warmth from them sent my heart into disarray. The dinner was simple yet far more delicious than I had expected. We ate together, talking about small things, Buddy's strange quirks, the winter storms that blanketed the town in snow, and our favourite childhood memories. After dinner, we sat on the long couch by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting a golden glow on Lucas's face, making him look even warmer and more inviting. I rested my head on his shoulder, listening to the gentle crackling of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Everything felt so peaceful, it was almost perfect. "Emma?" His voice was soft, breaking the silence. "Hmm?" I answered quietly, feeling as though I was melting into the moment. Lucas took my hand, his eyes meeting mine with a blend of tenderness and resolve. "I don't want moments like this to only happen occasionally. I want every day I wake up to start with you." I lifted my head, my heart seeming to stop at his words. Happiness and fear swirled together inside me like an uncontrollable current. I wanted to believe every word he said, but my past whispered that beautiful things could shatter at any moment. I whispered, almost afraid of my own voice. "Lucas, what if I let you down?" Lucas gently brushed a strand of hair from my face, as if trying to soothe the worries in my heart. "Emma, I don't love you because you're perfect. I love you for all the imperfect things you try so hard to hide." His words felt like a ray of light breaking through the shadows inside me. I closed my eyes, feeling like the broken pieces of my heart were slowly being pieced back together. But the deeper I fell into happiness, the more anxious I became. Every moment with Lucas was so beautiful that I feared it was nothing more than a fragile dream that could disappear at any second. On long, sleepless nights, I lay in bed with Buddy beside me, listening to the wind outside the window and the chaos of emotions within me. I realized that no matter how deeply I loved Lucas, I was still trapped between two worlds. One where I felt the peace of being loved, and one where I feared I would lose everything. One morning, as the early winter sunlight streamed through the window, Lucas showed up at my door. He smiled as he always did, but this time, I sensed something different in his eyes. "Emma, I've been thinking a lot. I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere." Lucas stepped closer, taking my hands in his as if afraid I might slip away. "But I need to know if you can let go of the past and believe in us." His question felt like a fire igniting in my heart. I had always been afraid to love someone completely, but Lucas was different. He didn't just love me. He showed me how to love myself. I looked at him, my eyes glistening with tears. I didn't answer him with words. Instead, I wrapped my arms around him and rested my head against his chest, listening to his strong heartbeat echoing alongside my own. For the first time, I didn't run away. I chose to stay, to love and to embrace the happiness I had once believed I didn't deserve. There were moments when we simply stood facing each other without saying a word, just looking at one another with a mixed feeling, sweetness intertwined with a touch of awkwardness. I wasn't used to having my heart laid bare like that, but Lucas was different. He didn't hide anything. One Saturday morning, Lucas showed up at my house earlier than usual. Buddy barked excitedly when he saw Lucas walk in. As for me, I fumbled, not knowing what to do with my hands, as Lucas came closer. "Good morning," he said with a smile, his voice as warm as early winter sunlight. "Good morning," I replied, my eyes flickering toward the dining table as though something interesting was there, even though there were only 2 coffee cups sitting there. Lucas placed a small paper box on the table. "I brought your favorite waffles. Does your morning coffee need a little sweetness?" I laughed. It wasn't the most natural laugh, but at least it made it easier for me to breathe. "You always know how to surprise me." Lucas pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his blue eyes fixed on me. That gaze made me want to run away, yet at the same time, I didn't want to move at all. "Emma." His voice, low and steady, felt like a familiar song that made my heart hum. I set my coffee cup down, my fingers unconsciously turning the handle to mask my unease. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I whispered, feeling as though the room only contained the 2 of us and a vast, quiet space. Lucas leaned forward slightly, his eyes seeming to see through every layer of armor I had ever built to protect myself. "Because I love how you try to hide your shyness but can't hide your eyes. They tell me more than you think." I looked up at him and felt my face flush, like a girl caught with her biggest secret. But I didn't look away this time. Even though his gaze made me feel more vulnerable than ever, it also made me feel free.
That afternoon, we took Buddy for a walk around the lake. Lucas told funny stories about the times he and his dad had mishaps while fixing cars. I laughed, but every time my eyes glanced at him, I felt as though I was being pulled into a soft, irresistible whirlpool. "Emma!" Lucas suddenly spoke, breaking the calm air and the sound of the wind rippling over the lake's surface. "Yeah? Have you ever thought about what makes someone love another person?" I paused, trying to come up with a logical answer, but deep down, I already knew. I took a deep breath and said slowly, "Maybe it's when that person makes you feel like you can be yourself without fear." Lucas stopped walking, his eyes so gentle that it made me feel like I might melt. "Then, do you know that you're the person who's made me feel that way?" My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know how to respond as my chest swelled with unfamiliar emotions. Lucas gently took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine as though it was the most natural thing in the world. No more words were needed. I understood that, in that moment, all the awkwardness and hesitation had disappeared. The days that followed felt like we were living in a romantic novel. I no longer avoided Lucas's gaze. I learned to accept it as a reminder that I was worthy of being loved. Yet somewhere deep in my heart there was still a quiet voice, a reminder that happiness could be fragile. Could I hold on to everything for long? Or would I lose it all because of the nameless fears inside me? Even so, I didn't want to run anymore. I knew that love wasn't flawless perfection. It was the moments we chose to stand by each other, even when we weren't fully ready to overcome every fear. And Lucas, he was the only one who made me believe that. The days with Lucas passed like a gentle dream, but I knew that every dream had to face reality at some point. I had stopped avoiding his gaze, stopped being afraid of the honest feelings within me. But no matter how much I loved him, I couldn't deny the inner tug-of-war that quietly remained. A part of me still feared the things I couldn't control. The winter sunlight slanted through the curtains, casting a pale golden glow over the room. Buddy lay asleep at the foot of the bed, his ears flopped down as if he were soaking in the quiet. But I no longer felt the ease I once did. I knew I was standing at a crossroads, either step through my fear or retreat behind the old walls I had built. The doorbell rang, cutting through my drifting thoughts. I walked to the door and opened it. Lucas was standing there, his face as bright as ever, but there was a deeper stillness in his eyes. He stepped inside and gently took my hand. "Emma, are you happy?" His question was as unexpected as a winter breeze slipping through a crack in the door, making me freeze in place. I looked at him, looked deep into those eyes, and realized this was no longer a time to avoid the truth. I knew the answer had always been in my heart, even if my mind had tried to deny it again and again. "I'm happy when I'm with you, but—" I took a deep breath, feeling the rapid pounding of my heart. "I'm scared. Scared I'll ruin everything, like I did before." Lucas didn't look away. He just stood there, his gaze steady on mine. But instead of reproach or an attempt to convince me, he simply squeezed my hand gently, his deep, warm voice wrapping around me like a reminder. "Emma, happiness isn't about whether we can hold on to it forever. It's about whether we have the courage to live fully in each moment." I felt tears welling up in the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the realization that maybe this was the answer I'd needed all along. Life could never promise that everything would be perfect forever. But the one thing I could do was live in the present and refuse to let fear make the decisions for me. Lucas and I took Buddy for a walk around the lake, where the frozen surface reflected the pale blue sky. He held my hand tightly, but this time, I didn't avoid it or bow my head to hide how I felt. As the sky darkened, we stopped at the wooden bridge that crossed a small stream. Lucas turned to me, his eyes filled with trust and hope. "Emma, no matter what you choose, I'll still be here." I squeezed his hand tightly, as if, for the first time in my life, I was learning how to hold on to something without fearing I'd lose it. But I also knew the path ahead wouldn't always be as peaceful as this moment. A few days later, as I sat by the window watching the snow fall silently outside, I wondered if I was truly ready to let go of my fear. I wasn't sure, but I knew I wouldn't run anymore. Lucas stepped into the room holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. His smile was as warm as the first time we met. He sat down next to me, placed the mug in my hands, and said, "We'll get through everything, as long as we try together." I smiled and rested my head on his shoulder. In that moment, all the worries in me quieted, even if only for a brief while.